I'm Felina.
And I'm Summer.
And you are listening to Broken Broken.
Because we're both.
The podcast about living your best life by getting real.
Hey, broken people. This is Summer.
And this is Felina.
I apologize for my voice, and I will probably be coughing in your ears as we go, but I've been sick, so you'll just have to deal with it or not. Okay, so you want an update on what happened when I went to court with my 15-year-old? Over the vape. Remember, I think we talked about that on Johnny's episode.
Oh, yeah, okay.
Yeah.
So what happened? Just a quick recap.
Okay, so there, his friend had a vape at school, and they never found the vape, so they didn't even know if it had nicotine or anything. But what they did was went back through the security camera footage for the entire day and busted everybody that had touched the thing. And they got in-school, I guess they call it in-school isolation now. Which is fine, give him that, you know, he's being stupid, breaking rules, fine, whatever. But they also did a law enforcement referral.
Oh, that's right.
Right.
Yes.
So he got a $181 ticket and a mandatory court appearance where they can give them community service and or probation. I'm so thrilled about that. I mean, and I had a long rant on my Twitter about referring juveniles for offenses that don't harm anyone. I also think I'm pretty sure I told the principal I hope he's proud of his contribution to the school to prison pipeline right before I hung up on him.
I think I recall you telling me that. Yes.
So we went to court, and he gets his little card. He was officially known as juvenile number 1 at the courthouse. And so we go in and sit with the city attorney who I do not handle being condescended to by men, particularly older white men, very well. So he's talking down to me, and I'm just like looking at him. And he says, "You don't seem to be taking this very seriously." And I'm like, "Obviously not as seriously as you are." You know, because he's recommending 6 months probation. He's like, "Well, did you know he was vaping?" I said, "Well, not specifically, but he's 15, so I assumed as much." Mm-hmm. Yeah, so then we both get a lecture about how this is illegal and dangerous. And I'm just like, okay, you already know what you're recommending, so can we just sign the paperwork and go set and wait to be called on the docket? So finally he does that. I don't think he was very impressed with me, which is fine. And I was ranting on Twitter from the courtroom. So in any event, in the end, he is now... My juvenile delinquent is now on probation for the first time. Proud mommy status. And and I was getting increasingly more furious as I was sitting there, not just because, you know, it's ridiculous to get probation over a vape, but I'm listening to the cases on the docket before us, and they're handing out probation for traffic offenses and all sorts of things. I'm like, this is insane. Like, who thought that these ordinances were a good idea? There's nothing okay about this. Nothing at all. And yeah, now my son has to be very, very grateful to me right now because when we were in there with the city attorney, I looked up the ordinances before I went in there because that's who I am. Yeah. Exactly. It does not say anything about vape. It specifies tobacco. And so he's sitting there telling me, we look at vapes the same way. Our law says the same thing. I'm like, actually, it doesn't. It doesn't say anything about vapes. And every attorney brain cell I had really wanted to argue this point, but then I'm like, I don't want to get my kid in more trouble, so I let it go. So he should be very grateful because that was painful for me.
Would have been painful for me as well. I don't know if I would have been able to restrain myself.
It was hard, but yeah, we did, and we got a lecture from the judge too, because that's handled in chambers because they're juveniles, so that doesn't happen in open court. So we go back there, and he's like, you know, making it clear he doesn't agree with the law, and he's like, but I have to enforce the law. And I'm like, actually, you have to enforce the law, which giving him the ticket would be. You don't have to give the child probation.
Right.
You really don't.
Right.
But you're doing it anyway.
Mandatory sentencing of juveniles. Right.
So I'm like, don't give me this. I get really tired of people making excuses. But in any event, so.
What's your Twitter handle so if anybody wants to read your rants?
It's at Chata Summer, and there's no vowels in the summer. So it's CHAHTASMMR. Okay. So yes, there's lots of lovely rants about there. I had people outraged about this because it's just ridiculous.
Well, it's outrageous.
It is. It's ridiculous. There's no reason to be funneling juveniles into the court system.
No.
Over normal behavior.
Right. Well, I look forward to an update on how your son's probation
Oh Lord,
goes.
if he breaks probation, I'm going to. Because I mean, anything can break probation.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, if he had that vape out on the sidewalk, he doesn't even have to have it at school. If he had it out on the sidewalk, he could still go. It's just ridiculous, and I'm still pissed off that we have these laws.
Rightfully so. Rightfully so. Well, anyway, moving on. We do have a guest today. I'll let Summer introduce her.
Today we have Johnna James, and she does a million things. How do you want to, what's your title that you want to use today?
So let's talk about standing our ground for children and co-founding that.
Okay, well, let's start with your story.
Okay.
Just a little bit about you.
Yeah, and then we'll go into that because that kind of helps explain and give some context to how that happened.
Like how I got myself into all of this, right?
Yes.
Okay.
So you were adopted, right?
I was adopted by a stepfather.
Okay.
And so even backing up a little bit before that, I was born in 1978, the same year that the Indian Child Welfare Act actually went into law. My father is a citizen of the Chickasaw Nation, which would have made me a citizen of the Chickasaw Nation. Today I am a citizen of the Chickasaw Nation, but initially my non-native mother would not let me enroll, specifically because of the Indian Child Welfare Act. And I knew that. She had mentioned several times growing up that, the tribe might intervene. And today we know that that's not true and that would not have likely happened. But she was 18 years old, young, not native, did not understand, which we're seeing that even today. Just a misunderstanding.
Every day.
Right, every day. But because I knew about the law from that perspective, I really wanted to know about what had happened there. So my Chickasaw grandmother, like most most Native grandmothers, she intervened on my behalf. So when I was 18, I called the Chickasaw Nation and they said, your grandmother actually enrolled you when you were a teenager.
Aww,
I know.
Good
so
for her.
So I did have my CDIB card at that point, and to me that was a pivotal moment in my journey. I did grow up the first 8 years of my life in a Native community, and I knew I was Native, but I just did not have my card. And that fight began actually when I was 5 years old, and my kindergarten teacher would not let me have my school supplies. I stood in line with the other Indian kids, and I was not on the list for lack of CDIB, and I was told to take a seat. And so those pivotal moments that you just know that that was the moment that changed something for you, and that was the moment that changed that for me. So as I became 18 and I started intentionally trying to reconnect with that piece of myself, I went to college. I was a political science major with the intention of going to law school, and I began studying Native law, and I studied the Indian Child Welfare Act. And through that process, I actually fell in love with the law. I feel like it's a gold standard, and I feel like if it had been respected in my space and in my story, then it would have protected my connection with my culture versus the journey I had to go back and the things that I had to go through to reconnect with my culture. So I was adopted in my teen years, and I had an amazing stepdad, but the point of the whole entire conversation is the Indian Child Welfare Act was thwarted in my situation, and my tribe was not notified. And had those steps been taken, I would have had people intervene and connect me to my culture faster. And I think I don't have any resentment towards the outcomes today, but I think it could have changed some outcomes a little bit quicker and better for me.
How do you feel about your mom having kept you from your community? Not just the legal aspect of the CDIB, but not being involved in... Because even if your father wasn't involved, there's family.
Right,
so
right.
How do you feel about that?
And that was kind of the main thing. It never really, I loved my Chickasaw dad, but it was more about my Chickasaw grandmother and the connection I desired to have with her. So I was very angry for a lot of years with my mother, and I was very vocal with her about that. I realize in hindsight as a mom myself, that as a mom, she was doing what she felt like she needed to do based out of misunderstanding, but still with her best interest at heart.
Yeah.
And of course, wanting to protect her children. And again, being a young mom, not understanding. But with that being said, that's why I'm such an advocate today, because it is the Indian Child Welfare Act. And so this was not about my mom, my dad, my stepdad, my tribe. It should have been about my right to have a connection to my tribe and my culture as a child.
That's what I try to explain to people all the time, whether it's adoption or custody matters, is a lot of times they're talking about what all the adults want, or what they.
Right.
And I'm like, but shouldn't we focus on the rights of the child? And none of the laws really. Well, the Indian Child Welfare Act is one of the better ones about focusing on the rights of the children. State adoption laws are absolutely not geared towards the rights of the children. In fact, they are written specifically to work around that. So
Absolutely.
that's actually why we won't adopt the what is it? The UN's Children's Bill of Rights. Is that what it's called? Something like that.
Rights of an indigenous.
Well, not just the indigenous, the children's entirely, because it would affect our adoption laws, and that's a multi-billion-dollar a year industry.
Oh, right.
Everything's about money.
Of course,
Yeah.
it's capitalism.
Right.
That's what it is.
Except for when it comes to legalizing marijuana. But sorry, don't get me started on that.
I know. I was getting questions about that the other day from somebody who's going to IHS, which is Indian Health Services, and because it's against federal law, they won't prescribe, and their position is if you go to an outside doctor and you come back and you fail a drug test, even though it's been prescribed to you, that you will not see that they won't see you anymore, they won't treat you anymore. And so she was trying to figure out how to deal with that. So I told her what, some of the things Johnny had told us about juicing and how to go around that, because then you don't have the THC problem to fail the drug test. Actually, it has the same thing. She has lupus too, like Johnny. So I was like, maybe you need to talk to Johnny about this, and y'all can figure out how to work around this, because IHS is not helpful on that. So you mentioned the gold. You used the phrase gold standard, which we hear come up a lot about ICWA. Do you want to explain that from a social work-ish perspective? I know you're not specifically a social worker, but
well. So I will also share I was an Indian child welfare caseworker and for a tribe for a period of time. And to me, the gold standard conversation comes from the other side of that conversation, which you'll hear from adoption attorneys or those that are the anti-ICWA crowd, where they will say it's an antiquated law. But if you study the law, it's actually not antiquated. It is a gold standard. So there are a few things that if you are an Indian child, you have certain protections. For example, you have active efforts in your case. And there's several places where they have to provide active efforts. One, active efforts to find your biological family. Active efforts to help your parents recover. So if an indigenous parent has a substance abuse problem and is ordered to treatment, then the case manager, as part of active efforts, would be responsible for actually driving that parent maybe to treatment or helping arrange that treatment versus just telling that parent you need to go to treatment. They have to provide the active efforts. But as an Indian child welfare caseworker who had state cases or in Indian children that were in state custody and having to sit in a state court and see the cases that were not ICWA, that were not Native, like it was seriously cringeworthy, because you would watch these children who just kind of skim the search for family, and then they were based with biological strangers. And then on the other side of that, you saw parents that are already struggling with mental health issues or substance abuse issues, and minus active efforts, they don't know how to dig themselves out of this generational, for our people, a lot of times generational cycles of abuse and mental health. And so for those children that are not Native, from my perspective, I actually saw a lesser level of effort to rehabilitate. And again, that's based completely on it's my opinion, based out of, though, my lived experience in watching that. And so when I say that ICWA is a gold standard, every child and their family should have active effort.
Right.
We should be doing
that as a minimum standard
for all kids.
Absolutely.
Yes,
they deserve to try to be placed with their family. We know that children with any type of familial connection, Native or non-Native, that those outcomes are better. And we also know that, children do better when they make it back home with their parents. And so are we really doing everything we can to make sure that those parents succeed and are able to get their kids back? And active efforts is a gold standard, because it requires that inside of ICWA. And I think all children should have a right to those things.
I agree. Active efforts, you have to actually try to help them find a program under reasonable efforts, which is what state law is. Literally all you have to tell them is you need to get treatment. You don't have to give them, help them find a program. And when you have people who are already struggling,
they're not going.
They don't know how to start. A lot of them,
right?
And then navigating the system to get in because we have so few resources is absolutely grueling. I don't know how anybody with mental health issues or substance abuse issues, I don't know how they would manage it.
Yeah.
Because I feel like I'm jumping through flaming spinning hoops to try to help somebody get into a program.
Right.
I don't know how you do it if you're already struggling.
Yeah, and you don't have anybody advocating for you.
Right.
Yeah.
And you mentioned native or non-native familiar connections. I want to make a point to say it seems like the most common misconception about ICWA is that a child cannot be placed with a non-native. And that's not true. Family is the first priority for placement. That's family, the child's family. It does not matter if they're native or not.
Right.
And that is the most common thing I hear of people who are opposing ICWA because they think that means the child's going to be taken from, say, a non-native grandmother and placed with a native stranger. Right. And that's not how it works. It's based on the child's right to their family and their extended community.
Exactly. So back to my situation, had ICWA been invoked, it wouldn't have taken me away from my mom,
right?
Because there was no reason to take me away from my mom. But what it would have done is would have required active efforts to repair that connection with my father's side of my family, and therefore my Chickasaw side of my family, and that would have been reversed, as well. So again, and we see that a lot. Not both sides are native. Right. But children have a right to all of their family connections. And the placement preference, it is family first. It's not native family first, it's family first.
So, you mentioned standing our ground.
Yes.
I'm about to get a migraine because I know the Veronica Brown case is coming up. Okay, so how did that start?
Well, give me a little bit of background. I'm probably not the only person who doesn't know anything about this. So.
Oh, okay.
Right,
yeah.
So,
those
tell
of
the
us
background.
who don't know.
I'm just going to sit in the corner and see while you explain
and be
this
quiet
case.
and see if we can explain this case. Okay. I don't know that there's enough time. I don't even know if we did a podcast series, if there would be enough time.
We can just hit the highlights.
Yeah,
right.
just a brief summary.
Okay, so trying to summarize, in 2013 is kind of when it came to a head. But there was a case of that involved a Cherokee child. Her name was Veronica Brown.
Mm-hmm.
And her non-native mother had put her up for private adoption. There were a lot of...
Without notifying her father.
Without proper notification.
And her father is native.
Cherokee.
Her father is a citizen of the Cherokee Nation.
Okay.
Her father was stationed in Fort Sill. He was military. He was served a notice, my understanding is a day or two before he deployed, in a parking lot.
Yes.
And he signed for the notice, but there was other things written into that notice. For example, I'm receiving this paperwork and I know my daughter's being put up for adoption. So that's, when you go look up the Veronica Brown story, that is kind of one of the twists in the story, that he signed off on his daughter's adoption, and that is not the case. He signed off on a notice in a parking lot.
Right. And even if he had, that would not be valid relinquishment under ICWA.
Right. Under the Indian Child Welfare Act, you do have to sign in front of a judge, and you have 10 days. It has to be 10 days after the child's born. So
now, mind you, this was a pre-birth match. She had matched. This was his first notification that she was trying to place the child. She had matched during her pregnancy with a couple. They had been paying her expenses, and all of this, and she went into hiding, so he could not contact her. He did not know this was happening. They intentionally hid the birth. He was not notified when the child was born, so he didn't know any of this was happening. And here he is, about to ship out, and he gets notified in a parking lot.
Right.
Okay.
So, my understanding is there were some court proceedings, and the child was actually supposed to go to family, and that was ignored. And she was, in fact, moved to South Carolina with the adoptive couple.
Without a required ICPC, which is Interstate Compact for Placement of Children. Right. You have to have the proper procedures in order to take the child to another state. That was not done.
Okay.
Right. So one of the things we found out during this case was Oklahoma did contract out the ICPC process to somebody that actually had ties to an adoption agency, and there were several.
Shocking.
Right, and there were several situations where ICPCs were being backdated, and that's not how that process is supposed to work. So this child did make it to South Carolina and through a court process, and at the point that Cherokee Nation intervened, there was not a fight for original jurisdiction. And so jurisdiction was moved to South Carolina. Adoption attorneys in that state have really done a good job of manipulating that state's laws. So if you are a father, a putative father, and you have not supported that mother up until birth, you don't have any rights to that child.
Oklahoma state laws are the same as South Carolina's.
And there's a father registry, and so there was some kind of things there as well that caused some issues in the case. So at the point that ICWA was invoked, the court found that she should be returned to her father. So she did come home to her dad for 21 months, while the rest of this case was played out. It went to the South Carolina Supreme Court, and then it went all the way up to the Supreme Court of the United States. So
with the worst ruling I have read in my adult life.
Absolutely terrible ruling. One of the things, and so I want to go ahead and add on to that conversation because it's just appropriate with the whole DNA mess right now.
Yes, that's what I'm thinking is all that talk about percentages and she's barely Indian. I'm like, excuse me, that's not how federal Indian law works. Shall we go back to law school here?
Right. You're either a citizen of a tribe or you're not. Just as if you're a citizen of America, we don't say, well, how much American are you, or how much Chinese are you? Like, you are either a citizen or not.
But that was actually written into the Supreme Court decision.
It was, and it was one of the, so the problem behind all of that is her CDIB card was not made public. It was not supposed to be brought up in court, but the adoptive couple did have connections to a media firm. And that information about her blood quantum did get out, and it was driven in this massive media campaign to say she was a drop of Cherokee blood, and because of that, ICWA should not be invoked, and it should not have been a consideration. Again, you're either tribal or you're not.
Right.
But it goes back to the impact the media had, that it ended up in the Supreme Court of the United States in their decision was to say Veronica Brown, a Cherokee child who was I think it was 132nd.
I don't remember.
I don't remember the percentage, but it does list her blood quantum in that actual decision.
It does.
And it should not have.
Right up front.
Right.
And it shouldn't have. It's not supposed to be a consideration. And where they did backflips to, and it was such a terrible decision that they actually issued new regulations and enforcement guides for the Indian Child Welfare Act because it was clear the Supreme Court ruling was clearly against the intent of the law.
Absolutely.
We affectionately refer to it as the day the Supreme Court was smoking crack. Or maybe that's just me and a couple other Indian attorneys. But they did backflips to say that ICWA didn't apply because it was designed to not separate intact family. So it went back to the fact that in both Oklahoma and South Carolina, unmarried fathers have no custody rights until given them by a court. Since he was not given them by a court before she was placed for adoption, wasn't considered a legal father. Therefore, they said that ICWA didn't apply because he was never really her father. It was not an intact family. Right. So not only are you creating a problem with ICWA, you just screwed over every unmarried father.
Right, yeah.
And
There's
military.
Such a thing as fathers' rights.
And military fathers as well, because
wow.
that's part of what happened here was there was the whole argument about, well, she didn't go to live with her father until she was two. But that's because he was deployed for a huge amount of time, because he got that notice right before he deployed. He went immediately to the next day to JAG, but there was nothing, and they filed paperwork, but literally nothing could be done until he was back in the country. So that's why that delay happened.
What a despicable
And then
thing
it was
to
used
do to
against
a man
him.
who's serving our country.
Absolutely.
And then that was used against him. So now there's this dicta in this case that can be raised again to to take away fathers' rights to their children.
I hate that. I was raised by a single dad, so that hits home. That's really sad. I'm embarrassed that I didn't know anything about this case, so thank you for giving me the backdrop of what it is that you're doing now.
Well, And so standing our ground for children, part of the problem was,
Sorry.
and why we argue today, people say, well, why is this DNA test with Senator Warren such a big deal? And this is why. Because the media really influenced this outcome. So before it got to the Supreme Court of the United States, my friend and peer, Dr. Nikki Michael,
I love Nikki.
She's an awesome professor of Native Studies, and her and I had I called her and I said, this is about our sovereignty, and this is about this child's rights, and this is an attack on our sovereignty. This is not about what's best for this child, because there were some other players in this game that really needed this decision for other reasons that were not necessarily about Veronica, that attached themselves to this case, being made aware of it through the media. So I called her and I said, we have to respond somehow. Like, I cannot, as an Indigenous woman, sit by and watch this happen. And so we formed Standing Our Ground for Children together. And
And is it a nonprofit? Or?
it is a nonprofit.
Okay.
So we are a program underneath the Lenapehousee Foundation. So we are, Lenapehousee Foundation is a nonprofit that Nikki has. And then so Standing Our Ground for Children is a program that we put under that, and we really tried to combat the media at the time. We were two Native women doing the best we can to fight for what we saw was happening to this child and her family, and what we knew to be was wrong.
And when she says media campaign, they had a huge media campaign. They went on a public relations tour, the adopted family. They went on Dr. Phil, talking about how terrible tribes are, just trying to steal children from their parents. These were not even, their adoption wasn't even final. It didn't finalize till after the Supreme Court decision. So they're, at this time, for all intents and purposes, foster parents at most.
Right.
And they're going on this campaign demonizing tribes for trying to steal children by giving them back to their families.
Right.
Wow.
So yeah, it was a whole interesting, twisted PR.
And the
thing.
name of their campaign was actually Save Veronica Rose. Like, this child needed to be saved from her family, which was actually, there was never anything proven that this was not a good family. She was with her family
And thriving. She
and
was doing
thriving.
great.
She was doing well and loved her family and loved her tribe and was surrounded by her people and her culture. And so we had started rallies. We, as Standing Our Ground for Children, we were at the courthouses. We were at the Supreme Court. We reached out to the United Nations and was able to get a response from them. They actually advocated for Veronica's rights as an Indigenous child to be recognized. The Department of Justice, we reached out to them, and they too advocated for her rights to be recognized. We had an effective media campaign as Standing Our Ground for Children. It brought a lot of awareness and really kind of told the true story when the Western media was really telling the story that this media firm and the couple was spinning. With that being said, obviously it was not an effective enough media campaign. We had another situation following right towards the end of Baby Veronica case, that's what everybody calls it, the Baby Veronica case, with a absentee Shawnee citizen, Desiree, and we had somebody reach out to us, and it was actually South Carolina again, the same adoption attorneys, and we were able to intervene, and attorneys were able to intervene. We were able to fight for original jurisdiction, and she did make it back to her family. So the outcomes, unfortunately, we cannot take back what's happened to Veronica. We'll have to wait till she's grown and makes her way home, but there were also some lessons learned from Veronica that has really helped us keep some children, been able to either get them home or keep them home. And so Nikki and I debated after Veronica Brown, after that final decision, and she was removed from, in my opinion, forcibly removed as an Indian child from Indian land.
Yes.
By federal marshals, which is just a violation of all kinds of laws.
Yes,
but
they literally sent federal marshals to pick up this child from her family.
She was a forcibly removed Indian child. And
I listened to Chrissy Nimmo, who was the Attorney General of the Cherokee Nation, and she's the one who had to actually take Veronica and hand her over. And I listened to her one time. She came to speak at OU Law, and she told the story about having to take her and her crying and how awful it was to make that handoff.
Right.
And she says, of course, now she's a mother herself. She wasn't at the time. She said, had I had children at that point, I don't think I would have been able to do it, because it was so horrible, because she was terrified. She's being picked up by federal marshals and being told, and has no idea if she's ever going to see her family again.
Right.
Oh, that's horrifying.
And so we really debated about whether we were going to continue with Standing Our Ground for Children, or at that time it was Standing Our Ground for Veronica Brown.
Mm-hmm.
And what happened is we had an influx of grandmothers and family members reaching out and saying, I have this Indian child and they're not with family. And we had national case after national case. There was one out of Alaska where grandmother was fighting for that child. The mother and child were moved from the village to the mainland to receive treatment for mom. Child was put in a non-native foster home while mom received treatment. Mom's treatment failed, and instead of sending baby back to village to grandma, the non-native foster parents were able to fight her, and I believe on that decision they won as well. And so case after case after case kept coming to our
This is way more common than people realize.
It is. And the need for somebody to help show where those resources are, or to help know how to fight ICWA in a state court. I know. So I was also part for the state of Oklahoma. We did a recruitment project when I was a tribal worker. I was a tribal chair for that recruitment project, specifically to recruit native foster homes.
Which we need more of, by the way.
We absolutely.
If you qualify
to be a native foster home, that's one of the ways. Like we need native people to step up and take some of our kids. And continue that tradition of it takes a village to raise a child, and in indigenous communities we need to step up and be doing that for our indigenous children. And so I was part of that project, and we found ourselves having to educate a lot of times on just to judges or DHS workers, or what the Indian Child Welfare Act meant and how it was applied. There was a lot of misunderstanding, and so we did and still do a lot of trainings about the whys of ICWA and the hows of ICWA. And so there's definitely been a need, and so we did continue with Standing Our Ground for Children. Life has been kind of quiet the last couple years, other than just behind the scenes. We've done some projects here and there and helped with some educational pieces and intervened as necessary. We've never had a case escalate to the level of Veronica, which is good, because we never want to put a child in the media. That's not what's best for a child at all. We did not. I mean, it's just not good for them.
Sure.
But at the point in Veronica's case, again, going back to adoptive couple, they had baby Veronica perfume they were trying to sell. They were marketing this child to bring attention to their own story. And I actually, as a Native woman, and I giggle because at the time it was not a thought process. It was as a Native woman, I have to do something for this Native child. But I called the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children and reported her as being exploited.
Oh, really?
I did.
Wow.
I don't think I would have thought to do that.
Which is why in the beginning.
But they really were exploiting her.
They were exploiting her. And so after I did that, I started getting fake profiles on Facebook made with my name on them, saying I was a devil worshiper, and just attacks on my children's blogs, and just all kinds of things out there in the media. So I became personally attacked for my response to those situations. But I do believe and still maintain that she was being exploited at that time, and there was a lot of money that came in from that campaign. And so it was quiet for a couple years until here lately.
Oh, Lord.
Right?
Texas. I hate you, Texas, right now. I really do.
So what's happening in Texas?
A ruling came out by a federal court ruling just came out in Texas. How long has it been? A couple weeks?
Like 2-3 weeks.
Yeah, it hasn't been terribly long. Stating that ICWA is a race-based law.
And unconstitutional.
Therefore unconstitutional under equal protection. This is supposedly, and this is where I keep getting, people who think they understand law arguing with me, because they're like, yes, but that's settled law. But you don't understand. This is intentional, because they want to run it up to the Supreme Court, because we've already got this history with Veronica Brown, and now we've got a different court makeup. And this is why Kavanaugh was so important, because Kavanaugh has a history of anti-sovereignty. So he will not uphold ICWA.
Absolutely.
And so this has been, we've known this was coming for years. There's been an intentional campaign with millions upon millions of dollars every year poured into it to challenge sovereignty through ICWA. And it's supported, there's groups who are anti-sovereignty.
Why?
Coupled with adoption lobby, because the adoption lobby wants to get rid of ICWA to increase the supply to their demand. And you've got the anti-sovereignty group, and they're just
and it even goes back to, and we saw some of these players that intervened in Veronica's case that had connections to the whole gambling piece, the gambling compacts, and and
That's
even
part of
attacking
why
sovereignty
that's
from
part of
that
why
direction.
they're anti-sovereignty is because
Absolutely.
there's the money issue.
Money. It all goes back to money.
Well, it always does.
Yes.
And so, explain to me why somebody is anti-sovereignty. I mean, how
Well-
does that chain of, how does that connect to the money? Like,
well,
how is that beneficial?
as far as it connects to the money, is you get she mentioned the gaming compacts, which is really the primary money connection to sovereignty.
Sure.
Because what happens is, like, particularly here in Oklahoma, the compacts have exclusivity agreements,
Okay.
which means if the state allows gaming that is not the tribal gaming, then they have to pay back. So each compact is different, but as part of all of them, there's a certain amount that the tribe pays to the state in exchange for exclusivity, which means they won't let anybody who's not one of the nations operate gaming.
Right.
So if they eliminate sovereignty, they eliminate all of that, and then they can build their businesses.
Okay. That makes more sense.
That's actually why Trump is anti-sovereignty. He's been complaining about this since the 80s.
Of course.
You can find the quotes. He has this huge problem with tribal casinos, and this is why, because it's competition and all of that.
Mm-hmm.
And so they've attacked our kiddos.
Yeah, they don't care how they're damaging our children for their money.
Absolutely.
It's sick. It's all sick.
Mm-hmm.
So this situation out of Texas was very intentionally played. There were several other states that had lawsuits, and they were all pulled into this district court decision. And my understanding that they've even created, or in the process of creating, a split circuit so that Supreme Court will be more likely
to force it.
to force Supreme Court to take it. I mean, it is genius level manipulation and tactics to get this to the Supreme Court.
Yeah.
And get ICWA stricken down. Well, so even ICWA. So we say ICWA, but really, if you read the Texas decision over and over and over, it says a racial class of citizens.
Right.
So they're really going over, like, okay, so for those that may not know, for the sake of this podcast, American Indians are not just a racial class of citizens. First and foremost, we are a political class of citizens, belong to tribal nations who are domestic dependent nations under the ward of the federal government. That is how federal law sets us up. Right. But if they can get us reduced to a racial class of citizens,
right, they eliminate our tribal governments. Right,
they eliminate all of those pieces of sovereignty. They are able to diminish our standing as a political class of citizens. Going back to also the current issue of why not a DNA test, and that's exactly why not. Because it's not a race base, it's not ethnicity. It is It is our political class.
And that's what a lot of people don't understand is Native refers to federally recognized tribes. There are plenty of people who have ancestry who don't qualify, and so you can't think of it as just ethnicity, because there's a lot of people who have enrolled parents in who are citizens of their nations who can't enroll themselves due to whatever their citizenship requirements are. So it's like a Venn diagram that overlaps, but they're not the same thing. Right. The ethnicity and the citizenship.
Right.
And so when we're talking about sovereignty, we're talking about the citizenship and the right to self-governance. And literally that can be gotten rid of by a terrible Supreme Court decision saying it's race-based, or by a single act of Congress. And with that, with one signature, all of our sovereignty can be gone, and our government's disbanded, and us left with our governments have been struggling for the last several decades and making progress on helping our people, and all of that can be gone overnight, literally. Because you think our state or the federal government's going to come in to try to help with those? No, it's not going to happen. They're just going to leave us to die like they always have.
So with that, there's been an influx of inquiries to standing our ground for children. Just the first week alone, there was 250,000 people. It was unreal. Trying to answer questions, trying to do more education. People wondering. There's a lot of people scared because they know as Native Americans that this is putting their sovereignty at risk, wanting to know how to help. So we're trying to get that information out there, and also getting ahead of the game when it comes to, if you look at all of the first slew of articles that came out, it was federal judge rules ICWA unconstitutional.
Right.
So
or strikes down
ICWA.
Which is an overstatement.
It's absolutely
scared people.
Right now, my understanding is that decision is limited to a northern area of Texas. It's not applicable across the United States at this point.
And it's going to be appealed, at which time, it's going to be stayed until that decision's made anyway.
Absolutely. And so, but again, the media articles make it sound like it's been stricken down.
Right.
And so now, who knows what DHS workers in what states are out there thinking, I don't have to follow this law anymore. So that was one of my main concerns, or from my perspective, was hold on, we need to make sure we've got this narrative right, and that we have right now. Most of the stuff you can find on Twitter and Facebook right now is with the hashtag #DefendICWA. So across Indian country and those that have responded, there's multiple organizations that have responded, as well as tribal nations, and you can find that #DefendICWA hashtag. But to tell everybody, ICWA is still here.
Yes.
We are trying to defend the law that protects our children, and we're going to continue to try to defend the law that protects our children. We're going to do everything within our power. Indian country as a whole, that is a positive of all of this right now, is to see the resilience and strength of Indian country. Like, okay, we need a response, so what does that look like? And so there's a lot of response, a lot of people on board. But that was one of my first main concerns as a co-founder Standing Our Ground for Children, is make sure that we got our platform back out there with information so that people could see what really happened versus reading these headlines that ICWA's been stricken down. So.
Right.
Yeah. Some of the articles
That's
were just
intense.
frustrating, because why don't media outlets have somebody that they consult with on this stuff? Because I'm like, whoever wrote this doesn't understand legal procedure at all, or have Google, apparently.
Well, anybody can be a journalist these days. I mean,
well, in that case, if you're looking to hire somebody, I will do freelance work.
I actually have a journalism degree.
Oh, really?
That's what I did before I went to law school. And more often than not, I'm like, why don't if it paid, I would go back and do legal journalism, because there are so many misinformed, so many articles that are so informative, and clearly whoever wrote them has no legal knowledge,
right?
No ability to explain how the law actually works to the general population, which you really need to be able to do in order to properly report on legal issues.
Right.
So, and misleading headlines like that and the consequences of them are often overlooked by irresponsible journalists, and then they give journalists a bad name.
Right.
So it's
well, any journalists out there who don't have legal expertise, you're welcome to contact with me. I will read your article and fix it for you for a small fee.
And I want to go ahead and put out there, for those that want to help, you can start by getting the truth out. So you can go to Standing Our Ground for Children on Facebook or on Twitter. You can go back to Summer's Twitter. She's retweeted, or tweeted a lot about this. Look up the #DefendICWA hashtag. There is.
What's the hashtag?
It's the #DefendICWA. So defend and then ICWA. But if you can go to Standing Our Ground, you could see some of the articles we posted. But there's actually a couple more spaces at this point. So there's Turtle Talk WordPress,
Yes.
which is I think it's a journalism place. Is that correct or accurate?
Legal.
But it's legal decisions that come out of Indian country, and so
Yes,
you can actually
it's run
go
by
get.
the law. It's run by tribal attorneys.
Okay, and so that
One
is
of
a
them
good
was one of my
resource if
professors.
Who is it?
One of them, Matthew Fletcher, was
Is
one of my
your
professors at when I did the Pre-Law Summer Institute out at UNM.
So I will say, if I ever want to know what the real truth is behind a legal decision that affects Indian country, my go-to is always Turtle Talk, because they're going to have the summary, and they're going to have the link to the documents, and you'll be able to kind of get the truth on what's really behind that. There's also an organization that's been formed, the Partnership for Native Children, and Chrissy Ross Nima, who's the AG for the Cherokee Nation, is actually part of that organization, along with my friend Victoria Sweet. And
Love Victoria.
I love her to pieces.
We've been discussing this.
Yeah,
I'm going to send her
so,
the link so she has to listen.
That's funny. As if she doesn't listen to Summer and Johnna enough.
Well,
I'm sure she loves it.
You can
though,
never get
every
enough
minute.
of us.
Right. So once they really organized the Partnership for the Partnership for Native Children, and they have created these documents. It's female attorneys, I believe.
Yes.
Mostly female attorneys.
I believe the entire board is female.
I think so as well.
Hell yeah.
Yeah, awesome, right? Awesome, great group of women, and they are really doing a good job. So their focus is on the media campaign and on helping people understand the legal decision, what they can do. They've compiled all of this stuff into some really good places and sources, and really kind of break down all of this conversation into a way where you can understand it, and you can see how you can move forward from there if you want to help defend ICWA. And then, of course, we always have our national organizations, the National Indian Child Welfare Association, has put out several things. And
We also have Oklahoma Indian Child Welfare.
The Oklahoma Indian Child Welfare Association. So ICWA, they have their page, and also have some email blasts they send out. Native American Rights Fund, I'm not for sure what their involvement looks like at this point, but they are one of the national organizations.
I don't. They joined the joint statement.
Right.
Other than that, I don't know what the strategy is, where they're going to fit in the strategy, but they're always watching the legal cases and doing what they can.
And there is that. So that is one of the things about Indian country right now. We did sign off on the national letter as well. Standing Our Ground for Children did, and there is the formation of a national strategy.
The letter was.
So the letter was a national response from several organizations, and I'm trying to think if I could figure out right off the top of my head who those organizations are. But I know NICWA definitely was one of the organizations that led the way, and I think that AAIA was actually
what?
They were actually one of the organizations that were the first to respond. Let me see if I can't find a copy of that. So the Association of American Indian Affairs, the AAIA, the National Congress of American Indians, the National Indian Child Welfare Association, and the Native American Rights Fund did release an official joint statement on the Indian Child Welfare case Bracking versus Zink ruling. And so with those organizations, along with, it was over 20 other tribal organizations in Indian country, just kind of put their stamp of approval on this letter, saying that we are going to fight this. In fact, it even says in this letter, I'm looking at it right now, through 40 years of implementation, ICWA's goal is to promote family stability and integrity. It continues to be the gold standard in child welfare policy.
Yes.
And so certainly, Indian country is determined and committed to fighting this decision and to make sure that our law that protects our children stay intact.
I like the sentence right before that. This egregious decision ignores the direct federal government to government relationship and decades upon decades of precedent that have upheld tribal sovereignty and the rights of Indian children and families. That's the most concise.
Yeah. That really
legal
puts it
statement.
in a nutshell.
Yeah.
Wow. So what do you plan to do going forward right now while we wait to see what happens with this Texas decision?
So one of the things that we're certainly doing and trying to be mindful of is to make sure that the national organizations are leading the way. We are a grassroots movement, so we are following the lead of the national strategy and doing kind of what we want to fall in line with the rest of Indian country. I think that the overall theme here, and I know there's a lot of organizations right now, there's a lot of people that are passionate, and we've had this discussion in Indian country about, this person over here and this person over here. This is not a time to split hairs. This is a time to get in line for battle, whatever that looks like. So our line in this battle is behind those national organizations that are leading that fight. And so we are going to follow whatever national strategies come out, those communications. So today's efforts include making sure that people understand that we are having to fight the Indian Child Welfare Act. It has not been stricken down. It is still there. We want people to understand why ICWA is still necessary and relevant, that our children still need the Indian Child Welfare Act, so do our families. And so right now it's just a lot of public relations and a lot of bringing awareness, like you said, not even knowing where this has been going on for years now. This attack is not brand new. This attack's 5 years in the making, and we really need to be careful about the conversations we're having in the media and not to be passive. This is not a time to be passive. We can't just sit back and say, oh, this is going to work itself out, because it could not, maybe. Right. And so we need to make sure that we are all on board. And whatever the profession, whether it's social worker and you're advocating, whether it's an attorney, there's across the board, there's a lot of people that have stake in this and that can do their part. And like I said, we're just a space for information. And as people reach out and can ask, we can guide them. In Oklahoma, I will say, they have really aligned themselves in the last 5 years since the Baby Veronica decision. There is a state tribal partnership grant for ICWA in our state. Wow. That includes educational pieces. Teata Purcell is the project director for that grant. She's Chickasaw, but there's actually that grant's out of DHS, holds that grant, and then the tribes have a piece, and so she's due the ICWA position. But getting out there and helping everybody be aware. There's Angel Smith, who is an attorney that is Cherokee, and really another one of the attorneys that's really on the forefront of this ICWA fight. She is out there educating as well, and has so I know what I was going. She has an ICWA bench guide that she has helped develop, and that has been put out through ICWA, and I think she partnered with them, and that bench guide's huge. Our judges that are sitting there making those decisions need to know ICWA.
Yes.
And so this ICWA bench guide helps guide the judges in Oklahoma.
That's great.
I know.
That's really
so
fantastic.
they have done a lot of proactive work in Oklahoma
That's
in the last
really
5
cool.
years, and so we're actually in a really good place. So on the state level, just whatever we can do to support those efforts. But on a national level, as far as standing our ground for children, like I said, we're just following the national agencies and doing what they need us to do.
Well, where can you be found online and in all the places?
In all the places.
Yes.
Okay. So Standing Our Ground for Children has got the Facebook page, and that's the one that really kind of most of the information goes out through that. And then we also have the Twitter, which is Standing the letter R and then Ground. And then of course I have my personal Twitter, Johnna James, JohnnaJames. And what I would really suggest is just looking at the Defend ICWA hashtag.
Okay. Following the
Defend ICWA hashtag, retweeting that, getting those stories out there, helping combat because there is still a media campaign on the other side.
Absolutely.
They really are trying to get this message that ICWA's been stricken down, and we really have to fight back. So if anything else, that's what we can do. Social media. Go find that Defend ICWA hashtag on your Twitter or on your Facebooks.
And share that.
Share that
stories.
and use that.
Yeah.
And that's another thing. There's some places where people that are pre-ICWA, a lot of Native adoptees have stepped forward to share their stories. You can go to YouTube and look up Native adoptees and look at the stories. ICWA, we didn't talk about the background of ICWA, but real quick, it comes out of the boarding school era and what happened with over 35% of Native American children being removed from their families. And so a lot of those children have grown up. There was also an adoption swoop era where Native children were specifically taken from Native homes and put in non-Native homes so they could be civilized. Mm-hmm. Those children,
right.
and
some tribes lost 100% of their children.
History, right. Yeah.
And so now we had the Indian Child Welfare Act. That's actually where it came out of. That study by Congress that said Indian children are being removed from their families at a disproportionate rate,
and they are still disproportionately represented.
Still are very disproportionate
in the system.
Absolutely. And so, so a lot of those children pre-ICWA is what we call pre-ICWA children. Mm-hmm. They have grown. I mean, there are elders now, and they can tell us the stories, and we need to listen to those stories.
Those
and we
stories
need to
are
share
heartbreaking.
They are very heartbreaking.
I've talked to several about it, and it's just awful.
It is heartbreaking, and
well, I'm definitely going to get on YouTube and watch some of these stories. I'm assuming some of them will be on there.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yep, you can look them up and share them.
Educate myself a little more on this. So thank you.
Thank you
for sharing with me, especially since I was not educated about it, but I'm sure I'm not the only one. So I appreciate it.
Yes, thank you for being willing to come on today.
Thank you for having us and for creating a platform to have this discussion.
Yeah. You can contact the podcast at brokebrokenpodcast@gmail.com. The Broken Podcast can be found on Twitter @BrokeBrokenShow, on Instagram and Facebook @BrokeBrokenPodcast.